So what's going on, guys? DIY Dan here again, and this is another episode of Outdoor Living. In this video, I'm going to show you the installation that I did for a misting system around the exterior of my covered patio. I'm going to go over the kit that I got, why I got that kit versus some others, a basic overview of the install because it is pretty simple. I'm going to go over what it cost me to put this system up, along with some problems that I had and the solutions to those problems. So let's get to it. So this is the kit I ended up getting. I couldn't find it on Amazon, so I ended up getting it at Home Depot. The main reason that I purchased this kit over some of the other cheaper ones is that the fittings on this kit were made of brass instead of plastic. I live in Phoenix, Arizona, where the sun and the heat are just brutal in the summer, and any time that I've tried to go a little on the cheaper side with something that's going to be outdoors, it just doesn't last. Now, because the kit that I bought would only go 12 feet with 6 nozzles spaced 2 feet apart from each other, that wasn't nearly enough length to cover what I was doing, so I ended up buying 2 additional kits. So that put me upwards of around $160 to $170 already in this system. Plus I needed some extra tubing, which I did find on Amazon, and that was pretty cheap. When I was looking for that tubing, I actually found a 20-pack of the tees, which are the main money to these systems, for 43 bucks. So instead of buying 3 kits and getting a total of 18 misters, I could have bought 1 kit, bought that 20-pack of tees, along with 1 extra 20-foot length of tubing for another 10 bucks, and I could have had a total of 26 misters for a lot less money than what I spent. So right here I've got one of the kits that I purchased, and I'm just showing you how these things go together. They are basically sealed with O-rings, and they are a quick disconnect. So you can see I've got one of the tees, and you just kind of press and twist the tubing into those tees until it stops. If for whatever reason you need to remove a piece of tubing that you already installed into one of the quick disconnects, all you have to do is squeeze the end of the quick disconnect and then pull the tubing by twisting it out. You can also use a 3/8 wrench because it is 3/8 tubing. Slide that wrench over the tubing and then push against the quick disconnect fitting to compress the tab. It will also help you if you push the tubing in before trying to twist it and pull it out. The kit comes with a water drain valve, so it'll bleed off the rest of the water once shutting it off. It comes with a brass cap to slip into the end of one of the tees when you're at the end of your misting system. And then obviously it comes with an adapter to go from the garden hose down to your 3/8 tubing to supply the misting system. It also came with some hanger brackets that had little nails in them that clip over the tubing, and then you can pound those in. Obviously that only does you good if you're going into wood, which I was not for most of the run that I was doing for this system. So I ended up going on Amazon and buying this little kit of self-drilling screws that were stainless steel, along with some stainless steel tubing clamps that were rubberized. And that's what I used to install the misting system around my metal covered patio that I installed the previous year. So I'm going to do an overview of the install, starting with where I've got it hooked up to the garden hose bib on the side of my house. Now, because my garden hose bib on the side of the house that I'm using is inside a shed, I've actually got a short hose running over to a manifold. I leave that hose bib on all the time, and then I just individually control my manifold as needed. So this is for my misting system. This is for our garden hose. This is actually for my outdoor shower that I put into place for rinsing off after getting off the pool. And then this fourth one is actually a garden hose I have ran over to run our outdoor patio sink. So anytime we want the misters, I just turn this on. Now, because of the glare right now, you can't really see it, but they are on. And then we also added the pump, so we just turn the pump on. And you can almost hear the difference in the amount of flow coming out of those misters versus not having the pump running. So out of the garden hose manifold, I do have a calcium filter, and I'm going to go over why that is a little bit later in this video. Then I have the female garden hose adapter that goes on the filter down to the 3/8 tubing that supplies the misters. That 3/8 tubing goes into the pump and then out of the pump with those same quick disconnect style fittings. The only difference in these quick disconnects is they do have an extra little locking tab that you put on once you've installed the hose fully into the pump. Besides that, the pump is pretty self-explanatory. It plugs into a 110 outlet and you just have your on-off switch. Now I do recommend turning the water on before turning the pump on and shutting the pump off before turning the water off, just so you don't possibly run that pump dry. I don't know if it's that critical or not. Then I had a small stretch of tubing and that went down into my water drain valve. That drain valve should be at the lowest part of the system, so when you shut the misters off, all the residual water in the tubing drains out of that valve. I actually used a second drain valve as a union basically because I was running short on pieces of a hose and I had to put a couple of them together to reach where I needed to in the system. Then I've got it ran up underneath the eave of my house and attached it to the trim. And because this part of my installation was attaching to wood, I used the hanger brackets that came with the misting systems. In order to not have any sag between the hanger brackets, I spaced those no more than a foot apart from each other. So right here is where I transitioned from the eave of my house to underneath the metal covered patio that I purchased and put up about a year ago. And this is where I used those stainless steel clamps and self-tapping screws in order to install the misting system around this. Now this first covered patio was 14 foot by 24 foot long, and then the additional covered patio that I put in was another 12 feet long by 14 feet wide to match the other covered patio. So right here's a good example of why I bought that extra tubing. Obviously it wouldn't do any good to put misters right in front of a shed, not to mention it would just get water on the shed and eventually probably rust it out. So right there I just used about an 8-foot piece of that 20-foot length of tubing that I purchased to get past the shed, and then I added another 2 additional misters in that open area next to the house. And since this was the end of my misting system, you'll notice that I did put the end cap at the final nozzle to cap it off. I also used that extra tubing to go around one of the corners of the metal covered patios and the transition between those two patios and the transition between the eave of my house and the first covered patio. The tool that I used to cut this tubing was a pair of loppers or cable cutters. You could also use a pair of hose cutters that uses more or less a razor blade. Another tool that works great to cut this material is a pair of PVC cutters. If you don't happen to have any of those tools laying around the house, you can use a pair of side cutters or dikes. I just highly recommend that you make sure they are sharp. Otherwise, instead of cutting the tubing, they might kind of pinch it and distort it, which might make it more difficult to install into the quick disconnect fittings for the tubing. For the most part, between each one of my posts of my covered patios, I had about 12 foot. So I would pre-assemble those pieces using 4 misting nozzles and 3 of the pre-cut 2-foot sections of tubing that came in the kits. I would center that and anchor that using the stainless steel clamps and self-drilling screws. And I do highly recommend using stainless steel clamps and screws if you're doing something similar to what I am in this video, because they will hold up to the moisture a lot better and not rust out. Once the pre-assembled pieces were centered and installed in between the posts of my covered patio, then I connected those using the extra tubing that I had. Now at first I did try spacing these clamps out more than a foot apart from each other, and I did get some of that sag in the tubing. So then I had to add another clamp between each one of those sections. One thing I realized about halfway through this install is when putting whatever type of clamp you are putting to hold this tubing up in place, try and put those clamps next to the brass tees, because obviously that is the heaviest part of this tubing, and that might help prevent some of the tubing sag between your clamps. The recommendation when installing a misting system is put it around the exterior perimeter of the area you're trying to keep a little cooler, to basically create a misting curtain around that area. It's also recommended in the instructions that the 2-foot spacing between nozzles is only good for about 8 foot high, and if going any more than that, then you need to lessen the amount of space between the mister nozzles. We've had our system up for about a month, maybe a month and a half now, and I can tell you it does help keep the patio a little cooler. We did put a temperature gauge inside the patio and didn't see much of a difference, but we can feel the difference, and it does help, especially in Phoenix, Arizona, where those temperatures are getting up to 120 degrees. So the initial reason I started putting up this system was because we had a big family get-together on July 4th, and we were pushing that 120 degree mark. So I had bought 2 of the kits, which only got me about 2/3 of the way around the area I wanted to cover. Everybody agreed that it really helped keep the covered patio a lot cooler than previous get-togethers we had had. So then I decided to buy that 3rd kit to finish going around the exterior of my covered patio. Now, once installing that 3rd kit, the pressure coming out of those misters was noticeably lower, and I did have to get a booster pump to boost that pressure back up for that extra amount of misters that I installed. Another thing you can try to do instead of buying a booster pump is adding a line to equalize the pressures. The only extra thing you will need is a T-fitting, which you can get on Amazon, along with a little bit of extra tubing. So right here's my supply. I've got like 3 or 4 misters on the actual covered patio that came with the house. Then these are the 2 metal covered patios that I added. So if I didn't use the pump, what I would have tried is getting one of the 3/8 tubing T's and run an extra line all the way to the end of the misters that I added. And what this would do is help equalize the pressure in all these misting nozzles instead of applying just from this. And as you use more and more water volume in each of the nozzles, the pressure is going to reduce the closer you get to the end. By adding this extra line, it's going to have massive amounts of flow going both directions, and it's going to equalize the pressure in all of these misters. Now, theoretically speaking, it would be better to do it actually from this point here and run it over to here. But with the way my system was set up, this is what I would have done if I hadn't decided to get the pump, to see if that would help keep better equalized pressure to the system. So this is the mister pump that I ended up purchasing, which brought our total cost up to right around $300 to $350. I was expecting this project to only cost me about $200. So it did end up being well over budget, but we do feel it is worth it and can now host a lot more family events during the summertime. So real quick, here is the misting system with the pump off, and then I just turned the pump on, and you can see the difference in the amount of water coming out of those misters versus with the pump off. So this video is about a week after doing the install of the first 2 kits, but you'll notice right here I'm pointing at one of the tips that had already gotten clogged. So when we first put this system in, I did not have this calcium filter on here, and we clogged a handful of tips almost immediately. Since buying that filter off of Amazon and putting it in place, I've had a lot better luck as far as that goes. Now, that's not to say it's completely eliminated the problem, but it has definitely slowed how many have gotten clogged on us. Now, I am in Phoenix, Arizona, and our water here is extremely hard, so it might not be necessary where you're at, but I will say it definitely helped clog less tips as far as the misting system goes in the short amount of time that I've used it. One issue that I did have with this calcium filter is it didn't have much as far as threads on the filter. So you'll notice right here, the first time I turned it on, I had a massive leak coming out of the garden hose adapter to the tubing. And the reason for that is it was not fully tightening down because the threads were too short on the filter. So I ended up taking it back off, checking to make sure my washer was in place on that garden hose adapter, which it was. I tried it one more time. It leaked again, basically because the threads were too short on the filter. It wasn't tightening down on the sealing washer. So what I ended up doing is putting a double washer on that garden hose adapter and then tried it again, and that sealed it up. Now, I'm not particularly fond of the way I had to fix this. And if I end up having to get more calcium filters, I'm going to try and find one that has a little bit more threads on it than the one I purchased. So hopefully I don't have to double washer that garden hose adapter for the supply. So right here, I'm just unscrewing one of the tips that had gotten clogged on me before we put the calcium filter in. After doing some research, it said that if you soak the mister nozzles in distilled vinegar, it might help clear them out. And out of the handful that got clogged on us, I'd say it worked about 50% of the time. However, I did go on Amazon and I did find a big old pack of these mister nozzles for only $7, so now we have extras on hand if we need them. If you end up getting extra tips, make sure that the thread pitch is the same between the T's and your nozzles that you're getting. So that's going to wrap it up for this video, guys. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it and it gave you some good information or ideas that you might be able to use if you're thinking about installing a misting system on your back patio. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. The whole concept of my channel is to give you guys the most information in the least amount of time as possible so I don't waste your time. And I hope to see you next time. Have a good one. Later.